So, going to move on to topic of the day and our new report, which we're very pleased and proud to be launching this afternoon. So, to take us through all things dementia, I'll hand over to Francis.
Hello. So that was the first of a very new voice in the sector we just heard. That is actually the voice of Yasmeen on that video. Just the format of that video shows that we have a young person in the room, and I've publicly expressed my fear that the workforce in the sector is steadily aging, and I think Yasmeen is definitely bucking the trend. She joined us in the summer, and I'm hoping that she'll join me in discussing her new report, which will be launched today. Hi, Yasmeen. How are you feeling?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. I'm really excited for today. How are you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You told me you were dead nervous.
Of course I'm nervous.
There's nobody in the room, it's just the two of us. So to kick off, so as I just said, you come at this from a very different angle from the way we normally enter the sector. What is your background?
So I'm currently doing a part-time master's in peace and conflict studies. So I have an interest in humanitarian concerns. I also think I've got an interest in feminist kind of politics too, so I think that kind of brings a different edge to things as well.
Cool. So it still doesn't quite explain how you then fall into researching dementia and housing policy, which, if nothing else, is very niche indeed. I've worked in the sector for 20 years, and even I have only sort of started looking at dementia and the challenges about how we respond to people living with dementia and their carers. So how did you come to it?
So when I first got the internship with you guys, to be honest, I didn't really know all that much about either what you do or really about dementia. So after doing a bit of reading into it and seeing some of the housing assistance policies, it was quite clear that some massive things are being missed out. And I think given the events of the last year with the care homes and everything to do with COVID, dementia has been an increasingly prominent thing that I think we need to start responding to properly and including properly.
Yeah, I agree.
On top of that, obviously, is the aging population that we're dealing with and more people having dementia. So yeah, I think it's over this past year especially, it's just become increasingly important.
I think even before COVID, the figures were quite stark, weren't they? I mean, Alzheimer's Society was talking about 850,000 people living with dementia, rising to doubling in the next 20 years. And 20 years is nothing in terms of housing policies. So it's definitely time that we took it seriously. Nevertheless, dementia is one thing. In the report itself raises quite fundamental questions around another set of other people, what we would traditionally have considered marginal issues, BAME and Lgbtq issues in particular. You insist are very important to policy making when we talk about local housing assistance. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, of course. So when I first started, I was given the task of finding best practice. So I spoke to loads of different people as to what best practice might be. And it started off with speaking to OTs as to it being person-centered. And then I went on to speak to different groups of people and start to think more about what person-centered would mean for me, for you, for basically everyone. And I started to realize how experiences with dementia are significantly more difficult and more challenging for people from these communities, which I had no idea about before. So, for example, in some communities, there isn't even a word for dementia. So not only do they experience problems from being from a minority community, but then they also, on the backhand of that, as a result of their dementia, experience exclusion from their community as well. So it's kind of like a double bind, really, that they struggle with. And I just thought that was really interesting and has kind of been overlooked from what I've found. But yeah.
Yeah, and my argument has always been that actually, if you get policy right from people coming in from the margin, regardless of what that margin is, you'll get it better for all. So, and I certainly agree with the thrust of that report. It's very timely as well, of course, with Black Lives Matters and LGBTQ. Very much to the fore. Again, I think it's a younger voice in the sector that has sparked that particular debate. So you looked at all the local housing policies published in England, and what did you find?
So I looked at the DFG data. So that wasn't specifically the housing policies. It was how the percentage of people that are getting grants for what disability. And I found that only 3% of the DFG programme was going towards dementia specifically. However, the main disabilities was like physical impairment. So a lot of this was going towards physical impairment, but people with dementia obviously often have comorbidities, which means that they're receiving adaptations in their home, but they're not specifically targeted towards their dementia, but rather other things instead.
Yeah, we've put up a slide actually, and it shows that certainly when we looked at it, only about 3% of people reported dementia as the primary disabilities, and we understand that comorbidities are of course an issue here. But even then, with 90% of DFGs going on level access showers, ramps, and stair lifts, it's clear that the program as a whole, it's one targeted at physical impairment rather than mental or cognitive impairment. So yeah, I think I would agree to you that given the challenge, we ought to do something about that. So,
yeah, so then I went through as many housing assistance policies as I could locate. And I found that only 80 out of the 343 housing assistance policies even mentioned dementia. So this often was in the case of just noting that there was a demographic increase or an expected rise in the future, that more and more people will have dementia. So there was only that 80 to start with. And then I looked further into those 80 that actually mentioned dementia and found that only 41 of those actually had a specific policy for people with dementia or used their RRO to target people with dementia in a beneficial way. So I thought it was quite shocking really, but it was an interesting find.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of work to do. I have to say that until Foundation started looking at the RRO, our first challenge was simply to ensure that local authorities actually wrote housing policies that responded to their local priorities. And we're really pleased, in all fairness to all local authorities out there, that actually that figure is written from in the last 3 or 4 years, from 46% of local authority having a specific local housing assistance policy to now over 90% of local authorities having a specific local housing assistance policy. And that enables them to do much more discretionary grants than there used to be. So given that it's a small number, what were some of the inclusive and positive policy responses you did find?
So I found some areas of really, really great practice. One of them I'm sure Becky will talk about in about half an hour or so. But I thought what she did was, what her area was doing was incredible, was the dementia-friendly radio just really stuck out to me. That was as a result of responding to COVID. They've brought in new adaptations to reduce feelings of loneliness and isolation. And given the situation of people being so dependent on their homes at the moment, I just think that was such a brilliant idea. Also, there were areas with specific dementia grants, which were around £2,500. I thought those were good innovations, considering most places didn't even mention dementia at all. So that was North Somerset, I believe, Oxford City, I think, as well.
That is Becky.
Again. And I also thought that there was some really good training as well. So some areas had engaged with stakeholders to ensure that their staff on their team, rather than having a single Dementia Friends awareness day, were proactively trying to actually get dementia training for all their staff at all levels.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, for many local authorities, they do Dementia Friends, what they call it, training, but actually it's just an awareness raising exercise and about actually addressing some of the barriers that people face people with dementia and their carers face in actually accessing services at home or in local authorities. But the workforce issue is a real one. If you look at the amount of time that's spent for an OT to work with people with dementia in their own homes, in their study, in that first 3-year study, let alone technical officers, who there is a real lack of continuous professional development in that. And I think that is a big challenge. We've started looking at some of the resources available, and they can be found on our new website pages on dementia. And I'm hoping that people will dive in there. We'd be very keen with the provider of some training to work with them to upskill those skills, because I think it is time to move beyond awareness and actually start looking and providing some solutions for people, really. So I agree. I think the workforce issue is a really big one. Dementia specific grants and pathways is interesting, because actually there is a tension between specialist services and inclusive services, isn't it? Ideally, you'd want to have mainstream services in which everybody can find a place. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that specialist need requires specialist services, and that tension has to be somehow overcome. I'd be interested to explore that with people in the audience if you've got questions or suggestions about how we might do that. Lastly, and we've barely mentioned it, I think you were quite. It's that different experience of dementia that really means that actually you have to talk to people with dementia in order to include them in the specification of their adaptation. That really matters, isn't it, Yasmeen?
That's something that I think also obviously includes the carer, and Rebecca Langbein touches on it in her next section. And I think actually speaking to carers and OTs and people that have not only had a diagnosis of dementia, but people that are looking after them, I think is also such an important thing to include in the process, and also something that I feel has really gone overlooked.
Yeah. So when you had a look at those dementia inclusive adaptations that might help in building resilience for people with dementia and their carers at home, what did you find? What did people in the sector actually suggest was in common practice, and was there anything missing in some ways? And this can come from the audience if you think there's a glaring omission. I thought that Becky's dementia-friendly radio is a stroke of genius because it breaks through that isolation. It addresses two issues. Not only does it address the tech deficits, but it also addresses the isolation and psychological experience of isolation and rage. Really good.
This is one of the things I found most interesting out of the whole report. So I sent out 2 pretty chaotic surveys to housing authorities and occupational therapists, and I wanted to find out what was actually being provided for people with dementia most often, and what the experts thought would be most important for people with dementia to retain resilience in their homes. And as you can see on the slide, what I found was that the OTs are recommending smaller, cheaper adaptations such as labels on cupboards and doors, something that I found Wendy Mitchell also mentioned in her dementia diaries as being a really important thing. However, the housing authorities are providing larger, more expensive adaptations. So I thought it was a really interesting difference between what the OTs thought as opposed to what was actually being provided.
I suppose it does matter how you function. I suppose the housing authorities would only be involved if there was a bigger grant being levered in. But I take your point, which is that when we speak to people living with dementia, they very often they don't want their house transformed. In fact, it's almost upsetting and confusing and anxiety provoking. What they want is small solutions, regularly updated to changing needs, and that can be as simple as Wendy said about putting a circle around your light switch so that you can actually more easily find it. So again, our website, we have got some resources that sets out there, and if you were interested, Stirling University has got many resources. I know that the University of Worcestershire, and I think Julie Barrett, who's actually at the webinar today, channels lots of resources that can help people make better design for people living with dementia. On the policy front, if you were a manager or a policymaker in local authority, what are your top 5 tips on making your local housing policy more inclusive for people with dementia? And I promise that's the last question, and it's probably the hardest one. So.
Okay, top 5. So first of all, I would say the obvious one is have a grant for dementia. I think that's, based on what we found, that's quite obvious, and that would be a good way to just include dementia straight away. Secondly, I would say including people from minority groups and their families and carers in the making of policy. I think that's an important thing to do.
Really challenging recommendation, but yes, I agree.
I think if you try and reach out to the groups that are hardest to reach and attempt to include them and their interest in the making of the policy, I think that's what's been drawn out of the report is really important. I also think including smaller adaptations in the policies, just so people know that they're there, is an important thing to do, because there were a few that had really simple things listed in their policy, but I just think it was useful to have it there. Then number 4, I would say including people with dementia from whatever community in more research. So the DFG data initially, obviously there was only that small percentage of people with dementia and that was dated data anyway. So I would say including them within research and actually presenting the feedback in more accessible and easy to understand ways. And then number 5, I would say having information more accessible, in whether it's in different languages or in places where people with dementia would be. For like example, one of the areas had information for dementia, like the help they had available was in hospital stands. So I thought that was really good. So yeah, having more available information and more accessible information. That's my top.
Brilliant. Thank you for unpacking the report. I'm hoping that Dan will put the location of the new report on the chat. It is a magnus opus, I have to say. It is very thorough and actually it provides a real synthesis of the current state of knowledge and moves us beyond awareness to something where we're actually going to do something positive about ensuring that people build resilience in their own home. And that building resilience sounds so clinical, but actually this is about ensuring that they can stay longer in the place they say they want to stay, and that's such an important thing. One of the shocking figures that I always find is that of the 36% of people with dementia who go into hospital at any one time, 36% of people living with dementia who go into hospital do not return to the place they came from. They go to a residential care home or another acute setting, and that's a shocking figure. That just. And there are many reasons for that, and I don't think Adaptations can do it all, or housing association or housing authorities can do it all. And I'm sure that we can actually build better places for people to return to from a hospital. And in the current circumstances, that is particularly important, because I don't think care settings are particularly safe places under COVID. So thank you very much, Yasmeen.